Our next presenter is Deanna Zantingh, a PhD student at the University of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. The title of her presentation this morning is Reconciliation is a Radical Ecological Vision of Care, Treaty as Deep Roots for a Renewed Social Contract. And you can go ahead, Deanna.
Thanks, Riley. So I'd like to begin today by focusing our attention to three events that occurred in close proximity this past summer. The first on August 9th, 2021, which is also the International Day of Indigenous Peoples. And on this day, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues called for a new social contract. Amidst the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is otherwise referred to as the inequality pandemic, the Permanent Forum called for the need for greater inclusion and participation of Indigenous peoples within social and economic systems, which were previously created by dominant groups' ideals and values at a time when Indigenous peoples across the world were simultaneously driven from their lands and prevented from participating in political and economic activities. The second event also occurred on that same day, August 9th, when the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a code red for humanity, stating that human-driven climate change is widespread, rapid, and intensifying, and in some cases now includes irreversible trends, placing us at imminent risk of hitting the 1.5 degree increase in temperature from pre-industrial standards. The third and last event preceded both of these former ones, and while long known by families and communities, broke into public consciousness in a new way as the mass graves of Indigenous children were discovered in Kamloops, with subsequent searches across Canada and the residential schools totaling nearly 10,000 graves to date. In the wake of the 6 years that Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission held national events to share these experiences, Indigenous elders have continually called for conceptualizations of reconciliation that address the harms of the residential school system and its broader colonial agenda to gain control over land in ways that include not only our human relationships, but our need for healing with the natural world and our more than human relations as well. I want to suggest today that these three events help us to see forms of structural violence that are undergirded by settler colonialism's shared meta-narrative of land. The same ideas that led to the dispossession and exclusion of Indigenous peoples from the social contract are the same ideas driving ecocide, genocide, and climate change. As scholar Melissa Pagan reminds us, at the extractive zones of colonial difference, ecocide and genocide collide. Normalized violence against lands, peoples protecting their lands is excused for the greater end of racialized capitalistic profit. The ecological vision at the heart of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission continually extends an invitation to reinterpret the values of settler colonialism in two important ways. The first is just by asserting that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a framework by which to advance reconciliation. And the second, and more important to our topic today, is by centering an alternative Indigenous interpretation of treaties that could lead to a social contract that is more inclusive and advances the common good. So one way to understand Indigenous interpretations of treaties is through what Potawatomi scholar Kyle White and Chris Cuomo refer to as Indigenous and feminist care ethics. White and Cuomo suggest that Indigenous ethics highlight attentive caring for the intertwined needs of humans and non-humans within interdependent communities, while feminist environmental ethics emphasize the importance of empowering communities to care for themselves and their social and ecological communities to which their lives and interests are interwoven. In other words, treaty is a shared human responsibility that is unrestricted in its attentive caring to the needs of interdependent human and non-human communities, and which empowers responsible living and community-based flourishing within overlapping relations and responsibilities of care. It's important to understand treaty through this lens because, as the TRC final report makes clear, the history of treaty making in Canada is contentious. There are abundant misconceptions about the role and interpretation of treaties, And Indigenous nations and the Crown have often interpreted the spirit and intent of the treaties quite differently, namely in two important ways. First, treaty is interpreted through what the TRC final report names as explicitly theological ideas. Citing historian Jennifer Reed in her article, The Roman Catholic Foundations of Land Claims in Canada, the TRC suggests that few people would regard the legal foundation of all land rights in Canada as conspicuously theological. In fact, however, it is. The relationship between law and land in Canada can be traced to a set of 15th century theological assumptions that have found their way into Canadian law. These theological ideas often refer to things like the doctrine of discovery and other kinds of moralizing narratives, such as terra nullius or empty land, or other Christian narratives which justify conquest on the basis of Indigenous peoples' inferior genus. In his book, Unsettling Canada, Secwepemc political leader and activist Arthur Manuel highlights this extreme form of dispossession, writing, "In Canada, Indigenous peoples control only 0.2% of the land, and the settlers 99.8%. With this distribution of land, you don't have to have a doctorate in economics to understand who will be poor and who will be rich." And he writes, "Our poverty is crushing." Secondly, and relatedly, treaty is also interpreted through a neoliberal capitalist lens premised on land ownership, control, and dominance. In the Handbook of Indigenous Methodologies, Henry and Susan Giroux contend that under the dangerous ideology of neoliberalism, everything either is for sale or is plundered for profit, and that neoliberalism's market ideology insinuates its logic of consumerism into all of our social relationships, effectively reducing our connections with the human and more than human world to either supplying or consuming in order to turn an endless profit from a seemingly, though ungrounded, premise of the endless availability of resources for profit. Further, neoliberalism's assertion of our market identities erodes at a basic level our shared human capacity for interpreting and defining our relationships on our own terms. In this way, the TRC is itself a mode of rendering perceptible our identities as kin with agency and decision-making abilities. In this way, the TRC strongly insists that treaties have a foundational role to play in reconciliation and are a model for how Canadians as diverse peoples can live respectfully and peacefully together on these lands. Anishinaabe scholar Heidi Stark makes clear that treaty making was a long-standing tradition among Native peoples, and the principles of respect, responsibility, and renewal include our responsibilities to and between the human and more than human world. Treaty processes with the British Crown were an invitation to these long-standing responsibilities that far preceded and are foundational to the formation of the Canadian state. The TRC devotes specific attention to the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the Treaty of Niagara. As a brief rejoinder, the British Crown issues this proclamation to alleviate conflict by delineating a boundary line between First Nations and the recently victorious British over the French down the better part of what is now the eastern coast of Canada and the US. Famed Anishinaabe legal scholar John Burroughs argues that this proclamation is contentious and it's just colonial script until a year later when it became a treaty at Niagara. Here he shows how big this event was by drawing on how many 24 different nations were present and by showing that Indigenous people have their own histories and stories of this event that have never been rendered nugatory. So while the UN call for a new social contract is admirable, in his article, Rooted Constitutionalism, Anishinaabe legal scholar Aaron Mills suggests that at its most basic level, treaty is not a social contract at all, but something much more foundational that makes any social contract possible. It is, if you will, the deep roots that might grow what is contextually needed in each dynamic and evolving set of relations between all beings. Mills elaborates on what he calls the earthway, in which treaty plays a central role. The basic premise of his argument is that we are always already connected in relations of deep interdependence, and that disconnection doesn't exist except artificially. He argues that healthy human societies or diverse lifeways are like trees. We begin with the earth and recognize that we grow from and through it. There's always more than one tree in a forest, but there is only ever one earth beneath us all. Mills invites us to imagine a different social order and our place and responsibilities within it. And in closing, in line with Indigenous and feminist care ethics, as characterized by White and Cuomo, which recommend actions with potential to heal or create worthy relationships, I take this to mean any social contract that grows from treaty relationship should help us attend not only to the need for renewed vision, but to the ways in which we need healing from the old one. So while these systems of death and social and ecological imbalance have unleashed a world of pain upon us, part of our collective answer back must include unleashing a world of healing.
Thank you so much, Deanna. That was wonderful. If anyone would like to unmute for questions, go ahead or drop them in the chat. I have a brief question that we could get started with as well. So it sounds like you have a lot of experience working with Indigenous groups, and I was wondering if you have any advice on how to energize non-Indigenous individuals and groups, educate, energize, and call to action about the need for renewed energy and renewed treaties like you've spoken about.
Mm-hmm. I think that I think often people are apprehensive because these can be such loaded topics. I think it's important to say that there was a quote I skipped over in here where a legal scholar is talking about how treaty is fundamentally first about friendship and how friendship regulates what is needed, and that treaty helps us to name what is needed anew in each new set of generations. And I think for me, the opportunities that I've had to work with Indigenous young people and communities and clergy are marked by friendship. And I think that we need to find ways, again, we live in a kind of an apartheid system that has kept us separated and has done that intentionally. And so I think finding ways that we can stay open and know that we're going to make mistakes, but realize the value in relationship and learning that can come out of that is something that's been energizing for me, and I hope would be for others in this work. Thanks, Riley.
Thank you. I can ask another. So I don't know if you've lived your whole life in Canada, but coming from an American context, I'm curious what differences you've seen in working with Indigenous groups with the Canadian government and with the United States government.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair question. It's partly why I tried to sneak in the Royal Proclamation reference, because I hope that at least folks in the States could connect to what that treaty, beginnings of a treaty were, and that maybe you're interested to see what the Treaty of Niagara really was about. Maybe I've sparked some interest. There's significant differences. I think even the reality that Canada has had something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where I think public consciousness is shifting, and people are increasingly aware of the impacts and the extreme forms of violence, even outside of things like residential schools or boarding schools. But yeah, there's also significant differences in how colonialism operated and how settler colonialism set itself up between Canada and the States. I think often reserves in the States tend to be bigger sections of land, whereas in Canada, they're tiny. In some Indigenous languages, the words for reserve are actually like leftovers. And so I think it poses some serious questions about what it means to share land and to share the basic elements that make life livable for all of us. Probably didn't answer that fully, but.
Can I ask a question, Riley? Is that okay? Deanna, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to like the relationship between theological assumptions and land law, and specifically how that ties into the TRC, because there are those specific calls within the TRC that pertain specifically to churches. And I think that's a really interesting part of the TRC. And I'm wondering if you could just kind of speak to that briefly as it relates to this broader project.
Yeah, that's a great question, Annika. By the way, it's very nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
I think the thing that the TRC is really trying to make clear in the final report, and maybe could have done it like made more clear, is that these theological ideas, even though it has asked churches and faith communities to repudiate things like the doctrine of discovery, this ultimately has to come in contact with the Canadian legal system, because these ideas are still operative in Canadian law. So it's one thing for churches to say, yeah, those were poor theological ideas. We're sorry for the impact that they've had. We're repudiating them now. The thing is, though, they're still ingrained in our Canadian legal system. And so that's where the challenge is. And I, in the larger section of this paper, sort of elaborate more on the TRC also has a call for a royal proclamation of reconciliation. So I think it's really important to understand what it's saying about that treaty, because ultimately it's advocating that Canadian law and Indigenous legal systems need to find a way to exist on a nation-to-nation relationship. And I think that ultimately repudiating these ideas, these theological ideas, has to equate not just to us saying, yeah, those were bad, but to really seeking justice on the ground, literally on the ground.
I think we have time for one more quick question if anyone has any thoughts.
Have you seen examples of these leading to gains of access to more land in Indigenous communities, or have you seen any success in heading towards that justice?
Yeah, I think actually in both Canada and the States, I think there are hopeful projects happening. Particularly in Canada, we're seeing more and more movement behind something called the land back movement, which you could also look up. That is, I think, quite a prophetic movement being spearheaded largely by Indigenous young people, often at risk of their own well-being, under heavy surveillance of the Canadian nation state in some pretty shocking ways. But apart from that, I think there's also things, I'm trying to think of the name of it right now. It's in the Midwest in the States, and it's like something land recovery project. So this is I think a Mennonite church initiative alongside some other things where people are sort of coming together and strategizing about how do we create systems that actually see land returned or land held in common or given back in a way that Indigenous nations can have input on how it is stewarded. Yeah, I think there's other things happening too, like nations themselves buying land back. Like, I don't think it should have to be like that, but we're seeing that happen. And then kind of buying into these new systems of carbon pricing to sort of, if you buy a forest and then the laws change to say that actually just letting the forest do what it do is going to help you generate something that you can sell off as a carbon credit. We're seeing some land restitution happen in ways like that too.
Interesting.
It's a great question. Thanks, Gabe.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deanna. We're going to go ahead and move on